First of all, I'd like to thank Dean Attridge and his committee for inviting me to present the Shaffer lectures. I'm very honoured indeed and delighted to be back here to meet so many people actually that I had met in my various wanderings and travellings in terms of the field of New Testament studies. Former professors here and also the current professors I have met on many occasions. So it's very nice to be back in a very friendly environment, and I think I have a former student somewhere in the audience, or about to be in the audience at some stage as well. He's now a graduate student here at Yale as well. At least I got a text from him last night to say he hoped to make it. So it's very nice to be in, as it were, at home with friends. And I hope that my presentation will be of help, if you like, in touching on some of these big issues that have been around in the field of New Testament studies, particularly Jesus studies, for the last 25, 30 years now. And at least to give you my take on some of these and my perspective on them from the particular aspect of Galilee. Just to say that my three lectures are entitled Galilee, Hellenistic and Roman, as I've here. Then secondly, I'm going to talk tomorrow about Jesus in Galilee. And thirdly, is there a Galilean Christianity? So I want to kind of take it along that trajectory, if you like, over the three lectures. And hopefully we'll find some nice things to look at as well as hear on the way. I've tried to not do a PowerPoint presentation, I wouldn't be so bold, but at least what I've done is to select from a large selection of pictures that I've taken over the years and I'll be presenting some of them along the way in each lecture so that you'll have pictures to entertain you, if not always you want to agree with what I'm saying. Okay. So without more ado, today's talk is, as you see, Hellenistic and Roman Galilee, a matrix for the early Jesus movement, ? I think too often we talk about background and so on in the field of New Testament studies in the past. So for me, the word matrix seemed to be a better way of thinking about an ongoing, living cultural continuum, as it were, that we can see beginning, the traces of it beginning already in the 3rd century, the conquest of Alexander and thereafter, and eventually finding an intensification in the Roman period with the Herodians. And that this is the matrix into which we have to understand something of the life and culture of Galilee of the 1st century, that which Jesus himself was part of and which he also encountered. The task of reconstructing Galilee and the task of the historical Jesus I see as two quite separate enterprises. But very often in recent scholarship, it seems to me, they have got collapsed into one. And so we get everything from the cynic Jesus to the revolutionary Jesus to whatever other Jesus you're having yourself, as they say. And so it seems to me that it's important for us to keep these two enterprises methodologically separate, even though they do overlap, of course, as we'll see. But I think it's quite important for us, and that's why I wanted to begin this morning with this first talk, which we won't be about Jesus, but just simply about that matrix into which he belonged and to which he was part of, as I say, and was influenced by, I want to say. So I'll just pass over some of my introductory remarks I had here. In what follows, I'm interested in discussing Galilee as matrix or context for Jesus, drawing on both archaeological and literary evidence, including the Gospels. My assumption is that while archaeology can tell us nothing directly and specifically to do with Jesus, it can, when used critically, help us to fill out the picture, aspects of which the Gospels leave vague and even ignore altogether. For example, we never hear of Sepphoris or Tiberias in the Gospels, and yet these were two very dominant settlements or foundations in the 1st century, and Jesus would surely have been aware of them, and perhaps, as we'll talk later in other talks, did he or did he not, in fact, even possibly visit them. So what I tried to do in this first talk this morning, then, is to pick out three issues that seem to me to be of particular significance for from our sorry, I don't want to get my pages mixed up here too quickly. Three different aspects, if you will, of this matrix, and ask questions about what we can learn about them from the archaeology and from the literary evidence, and see what kind of picture of Galilee will emerge from that and how it might line up with some other ones, including Ernst Renan's, that has already been mentioned, that wonderful romantic picture of Galilee that he paints for us in his Life of Jesus almost 150 or 200 years ago almost now. Now, my first topic then is, I'll just move it on here, I think. Yes, Hellenization in Galilee, syncretism or selection. The impact of Hellenization on Jewish belief and practice has in the past been discussed in terms of two opposing and implacable forces, Hellenismos and Judaismos, Hellenism and Judaism. This opposition is based on the highly apologetic accounts of 1 and 2 Maccabees, where these neologisms occur. However, archaeology has played its part in changing this picture, since it's now generally recognized that the series attempt by Antiochus IV Epiphanes to transform Jerusalem cult center into a shrine of Zeus, the head of the Greek pantheon, was a brief but shocking interlude in the mid-2nd century BCE. Like other indigenous peoples of the Near East, the Jews were able to accommodate their own unique beliefs and practices to the new and emerging zeitgeist, while also benefiting from the advantages of this new world order brought to the Eastern Mediterranean. The accommodation that took place varied from period to period and from place to place. The decline of both the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, the dynasties that were built on Alexander's legacy in Egypt and Syria respectively, meant that indigenous peoples like the Judeans, the Nabateans and the Itureans were able to reclaim ethnic independence and continue to function as client kingdoms even under Roman rule, imperial rule later. That's not to suggest, though, that the arrival of the Greeks in the East had no impact on the overall culture of the region. In an important article dealing with the Hellenization of the Phoenician cities, ancient historian, Oxford historian Fergus Miller, has pointed out that because of their extensive seafaring exploits in the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians had a long acquaintance with the Greek world prior to Alexander's campaigns in the East. This meant that cultural change associated with the process of Hellenization was more of translation rather than wholesale change, in the case of their territories, which included the Galilean hinterland also. Greek became the lingua franca of trade and commerce from the 3rd century BCE, with inevitable consequences for Galilee as well. Greek technical expertise in fishing, pottery making, and other local industries can be observed. The native gods were often given a Greek name, but without changing their basic characters. Here I'll just look at a few slides for you first. This is one from Tel Dan. It's entitled "To the God who is in Dan, Zoilos made a vow." It's a bilingual inscription found at Dan. And it gives us some idea, I suppose, of the who is this God? It raises a very interesting question. There's no name for this God. Is it perhaps Yahweh still, or is it simply a local deity that is being honoured at this ancient shrine? Just then, here a much later mosaic from Shaffer, but one that I think equally illustrates what I'm point of making, this drinking contest between Dionysus and Heracles. You can see Dionysus with his cup up, whereas Heracles is slightly worse for wear. Another inscription found at Kadesh in Upper Galilee, Hellenistic seal from Kadesh in Upper Galilee, symbol of Tanit, a Tyrian goddess. These are all in the region of the Phoenician hinterland of Upper Galilee. Asklepius and Jesus, we'll come back to this particular slide, I'll use it again later, but just wanted to mention briefly the Asklepius cult as well, because at Eshmun, Eshmun, the god of Sidon, was renamed Asklepios, and of course there's plenty of evidence of Asklepius worship as well in the Transjordan region. I'll come back to that slide again. And finally, our friend Dionysus at Bet-Shan Scythopolis, Nissus Scythopolis. And I give you there an inscription with good luck. Seleucus, son of Ariston, made this altar as an offering to the god Dionysus, the Lord founder. Tistes, the founder of the city. So that's a very nice slide. I like it myself. You see this is the Roman site at the front, as you know, and the Tel Dan at the background. But it still gives us some sense of the ongoing, as it were, presence of these Greek deities in the region. I mentioned them here, Dionysus, founder, and so on. Finally, there's one final one that's of interest. Well, I'll talk about this slide as well, the famous Mona Lisa of Galilee from the Roman villa at Sepphoris. I'll speak about that later, to do with the cult of Dionysus in the region. But here we have the sacred cave of Pan at Banias in Caesarea Philippi. Now, it seems to me that in other words, the very notion of Galilee, the very name itself, the Galilee, it can be seen, if we kind of were to draw a map of that, there's a circle, if you like, of these sites, from Tyre and Sidon on the coast to Dan, and then farther south to Bethshan, Scythopolis. So Galilee is encircled, and indeed that's the very meaning of the name, Galil, Ha-Galil, this circle originally. And so we can see that there were undoubtedly Greek influences in that whole region. And the question, I suppose, that faces us is how dramatic were they in terms of changing older patterns of belief and practice, and what other kinds of changes, social and economic, did they bring to the region? I'll just move on here. I'm conscious of time because the danger with slides and a lecture is that you give 2 lectures rather than 1, so I must be careful. We pick up literary mention of Galilee in the first book of Maccabees, in the middle of referring to the attack on the people of Galilee by the surrounding peoples in 1 Maccabees chapter 5. And as a result, they had to be transported back to Judea in the south. 1 Maccabees 5:15, where there's an allusion, it seems to me, to the famous phrase from Isaiah, Galil ha-Goim, Galilee of the nations. Now it's translated by the author of 1 Maccabees as Galilee ala Fulon, Galilee of the other tribes or other peoples. Is it more ethnically stronger than perhaps Galilea ton ethnon, which the Septuagint has for that passage in Isaiah. The main point being, of course, that this description of Galilee of the nations, Galil ha-Goim, that this inscription had become, as it were, pretty standard for describing the social conditions and the religious affiliations of Galilee in the first century. In fact, no less an authority than the new Shooter, which was reworked and so on in the late decades of the last century. They used this very phrase as a kind of blanket description of Galilee in the period, and it gives rise then to our ability to see all kinds of people there that are Greeks, like cynics and others, walking the streets of all the Galilean villages. Yet it's by no means the whole story that an archaeologist has helped considerably to fill in some instances correct. There are the partisan accounts of both the literary sources and our modern readers. For centuries, Galilee had served as a supplier of wheat, wine and oil to the city of Tyre, whose original territory was quite limited. That's according to Ezekiel chapter 28. This relationship was to continue into the Roman period and would explain the prevalence of Tyrian coinage at sites in Upper and Lower Galilee and the use of the Tyrian half shekel as the coin of the sanctuary, despite its bearing the image of Tyre's city god Melkart Heracles. I think I perhaps overlooked to mention that several of the city gods in the Phoenician cities, I did mention Eshmun being Asklepius, but also Melkart being named as Heracles. An incident reported in 2 Maccabees 4:18-20 is indicative of Jewish accommodation in this regard. On the occasion of the quadrennial games at Tyre, Jason, the leader of the pro-Hellenistic party, who had occupied the position of high priest briefly and had established a Greek-style gymnasium in Jerusalem, sent a delegation described as, quote, the Antiochian citizens from Jerusalem, with an offering of 300 silver drachmas to honour the patron god of the games, Heracles. However, on arrival in Tyre, the delegation decided that such use of the money was inappropriate and allowed it to be used instead for the building of triremes, thus boosting Tyrian sea power. Religious belief, Greek culture, and economic realities all intermingle in this incident. It is noteworthy that despite the way in which the delegation is given a decidedly Greek profile, the Antiochian citizens from Jerusalem, they demurred at appearing to worship the pagan god. In all probability, this attitude is indicative of the relationships that continue to prevail into the first century of the Common Era. Even those who might have benefited from the new possibilities of the Greek world and were prepared to participate in certain aspects of the new cultural situation drew the line when it came to worshipping a god other than Yahweh. Yet the account of 2 Maccabees chapter 10, 1-8, dealing with the rededication of the temple after 3 years of its being in use as the cult center of Zeus, might suggest that some Jews had indeed engaged in Bacchic revelries. There's a quotation here from verse 8 of chapter 10, verse 8, wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. That suggests to me a certain form of Bacchic revelry that was going on. The rededication, interestingly, took place on the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, which was, of course, an old feast associated with the wine god in the East. Thus, it would seem that the gradual emergence of the Hasmonean state, the Judean successor of the Maccabean freedom fighters, during the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE, did not involve turning the clock back with regard to the ongoing process of Hellenization, as this had developed over 3 centuries since Alexander. It could be argued that the Herodian period saw an even more intensified process of Hellenization, in that Roman imperial aspirations took it on a decidedly Greek colouring. When one compares, however, the ways in which the Hasmoneans and Herodians, elites in Palestine, embraced aspects of the Greek way of life, it can be said that while the former, that is the Hasmoneans, acted Greek without becoming Greek, the Herodians did in fact become Greek and support the Greek culture. At least that's the way one scholar has put it, and I think it's rather well put. It must be remembered that the Herodians were client kings of Rome and were therefore more likely to follow the trends that were set at the centre. Yet Herod was indeed convinced Helene, and his architectural legacy, as well as other aspects of his rule, make clear. A trend in recent scholarly portraits of this enigmatic character is to suggest that his concerns for his Jewish subjects were real. So much so, in fact, that he may even have seen himself as a second Solomon because of his desire to rebuild the Jerusalem temple on a grander scale than before, according to Josephus in Book 15 of the Antiquities. This portrayal may owe something to Josephus' rhetoric. It is certain that the 3 temples which Herod did build in order to honour Rome and Augustus were located outside the recognised Jewish territory, namely at the 2 Caesareas, Marishima on the coast and Philippi in the north, and one at Sebaste, Samaria in the centre of the country. I think I have some slides of these now. Sorry, but this is my text, actually. We'll come back to that again some other time. Yeah, the Herodian temples. Herod's temples to Roman Augustus, Caesarea Maritima, and Caesarea Philippi. This is on the bottom here is the arrow here. This slide is just an artist's reconstruction of Caesarea Maritima, and here is the steps and the podium of the temple in at Samaria Sebaste. We have nothing, unfortunately, from Caesarea Philippi, at least nothing certain, though an American scholar, a friend of mine, Andrew Overman, who's working at a place south of Caesarea Philippi, has found what he thinks is definitely a Roman temple, and he'd like to think that it's Herod's temple as well, but we're not sure about that. Now, Antipas's, after Herod the Great, his son Antipas was to take over as Tetrarch of Galilee, and Josephus describes his work in terms of refurbishing of Sepphoris and the foundation of Tiberias, both to honour the Roman emperor. Sepphoris got the name Autocrator, sole ruler, and Tiberias, of course, was named after Augustus' successor. These are just 2 slides. This is just some indication of the Roman gate at Tiberias, the coin of Herod Antipas, and the architectural reconstruction of the Roman gate. Now, the question therefore would be, and we'll have to look at it more closely in a moment, whether or not the arrival of the Herodians and the Herodian building in Galilee, Herod the Great doesn't seem to have built very much in Galilee itself, whether or not that arrival was to increase, if you like, the Hellenistic influences in Galilee itself. So I go on to my second part of my paper, a second topic that I think is important, namely a Jewish Galilee. Question mark. Sorry, I must get myself some water. Would it be terribly embarrassing if I took off my jacket? It was very warm up here. I feel absolutely... Thank you. So then, if Galilee had not become a sea of Greek culture by the 1st century, where did its population come from? How Jewish was it? How did Galilean Jews relate to their Judean cousins in terms of practice and belief? Inevitably, there was a change of emphasis in regard to the various symbols that together made up the Jewish religious belief system after the destruction of the temple in 70. When scribes and rabbis, Torah and Torah study replaced priests, pilgrimage, and sacrifice. Well, what can we say about Galilee at the time of Jesus, particularly in view of the highly negative opinion of their knowledge and practice of Torah expressed by the Jerusalem scribes in the fourth gospel? These Galileans who do not know the law are accursed, John 7:24. It must be remembered that the Judean expansion to the north by the Hasmoneans involved Greek military strategy and even the use of foreign mercenaries, while being aimed at reclaiming what the author of 1 Maccabees describes as the ancestral lands. Archaeology can fill out further this story of reclaiming the land. Sites such as important Persian Greek cultic site, Mispey, Yamim, as well as other lesser settlements in Galilee, where there's evidence from pottery remains, would point to a non-Jewish population, begin to disappear by the mid-2nd century BCE. These are some examples of some of the cultic objects found at Mispey, Yamim. That is the mountain of the face of the two seas. It's a high place, if you like, and this is an Egyptian. It's not very. I'm afraid the picture isn't very good, but you get a Phoenician inscription at the top to Astarte because she listens. But it was originally used as a situla or a ritual vessel for honouring the Egyptian gods. And another one. This is the Epis bull with the globe from Mispey Yamim as well. So what we have, in other words, is evidence of this shrine being actually positively destroyed and destruction there, and that has been associated by most scholars with the Hasmonean expansion to the north. At the same time, other new sites are appearing, especially in eastern Galilee and the Golan, which on the basis of various identity markers are assumed to be Judean settlements, the result of immigration from the south. This is a map here which gives you some idea. You can see the number of sites with the menorahs. They're all in... Oh, I've done something wrong. Help. Okay, let's see if we get back to it. Oh. Oh, yeah. Here we are. Well, I'll get back to it quickly, okay. There we are, got back to it, okay. I'll be very careful from now on. You see this circle here on both sides of the Galilee Golan as where identifiable sites of Jewish character have been discovered, with several different surveys have been conducted. One most recently by a young Israeli scholar, Uzi Leibner, in this region, and he's now digging some of those sites as well, and is rediscovering many of the Jewish objects and Jewish material that indicate clearly that they were inhabited by Jewish people of Judean extraction and Judean loyalties. According to several surveys conducted in the region as a whole, the number of these sites continued to increase exponentially into the Roman period. Surface surveys alone can be unreliable, however, especially wherever detailed excavations have taken place. A consistent pattern seems to be emerging with regard to the presence of stone vessels, oil lamps, and household pottery similar to those found in Jerusalem, Judea. I think I have some of these. This is Gamla, definitely a site just across the Jordan in the Golan. We'll be talking a bit about that later. I just put various different bits from it. On the top right-hand side there, we see a mikvah. There's a plaster ritual pool just outside located outside the synagogue. This is one of the few... if I could go back, just let me see. Can I go? One of the few pre-70s sites that have been identified, definitely the synagogue with benches around the walls, nothing more than that. Picture Gamla itself, of course, and you can see the Roman wall along the side. And here we have a Jewish coin minted during the revolt, which is written in Paleo-Hebrew script and says something like, for Jerusalem the Holy, for the redemption of Zion, Jerusalem the Holy. And finally, a cache of coins, 2.5 shekels, that were intended presumably for upkeep of the temple in Jerusalem. As I mentioned already, it was the coin of the sanctuary. So Gamla is one of the sites that has been well excavated, and it gives us some sense. It's a larger site, the much smaller ones. Many of the other ones are much smaller, but it gives us a sense, if you will, of the presence of a Jewish community and how their identity was shaped by their contacts with Jerusalem and with the south. In addition, the presence of step pools, usually identified as mikvaot, or ritual baths at various village sites and in domestic settings, as well as the distinctive modes of burial common in Judea, all point to the fact that these settlers were of Judean origin. Think of the Judean-type potteries found in Galilee. Small stone dishes in particular, the stone, of course, being material that's less susceptible to cracking and therefore more user-friendly in terms of ritual purity. A mikvah from Jerusalem with the divider, suggesting that very strict observance. People enter by one just beside the temple, and then the next one is from domestic settings in Sepphoris, a mikvah as well. So we see examples, therefore, of what's going on in Judea in terms of the expansion, if you like, of the ritual concerns associated with the temple into the everyday lives of people, that is being also conducted in Galilee as well. Now, so despite their loyalty to their cultural background and the symbol system comprising of temple, land and Torah, these recent arrivals into Galilee seem to have availed of the possibilities that their new environment had to offer. Opportunities that involve benefiting from the natural resources of Galilee's soil, water and climate, and finding ways to export their produce to other regions, such as Tyre, the Decapolis and Judea as well. In a word, they availed of the increased opportunities that Hellenization offered, while still remaining staunchly loyal to their Judean roots. This means that some at least of the population would have acquired some facility of the Greek language, yet the older Aramaic, which had held sway since Persian times, would have remained the language of the majority of the population. As mentioned already, Herod, an Idumean by birth, but with a Jewish mother, showed a certain respect for his Jewish subjects. His most bitter internal opponents would have been the supporters of the ousted native Judean aristocracy, the Hasmoneans. His enlargement of the Temple Mount and his renewal of the building was intended to show his respect for Jewish beliefs, though even there one can see a fascination with Roman architectural styles and lifestyles. The presence of mikvaot at his palaces in Jericho and Masada, side by side with Roman-style bathhouses, raises the intriguing possibility that concern for ritual purity went right to the inner court of the Herodian elite, who would frequent these palaces, even if it was not observed by Herod himself. His son Antipas was ruler, not king, in Galilee from Herod's death until 37, therefore spanning the childhood, youth, and adulthood of Jesus of Nazareth. His rebuilding of Sepphoris and renaming it as autocrator or sole ruler, and his foundation in 19 of the new city, Tiberias, took place when Jesus, the tecton from Nazareth, was a young man. Though not on the lavish scale of his father's building projects, these were significant nonetheless. Yet so far, nothing has been discovered that would suggest any open rejection of the Jewish heritage, neither temples or coins or statuary, even when his own private life, that is Antipas's own private life, was in contravention of Jewish family law. So anyhow, we just leave it. These are just some more examples, if you like, of Judean, an incense shovel and an oil lamp with provenance in Jerusalem found at Sepphoris. So I come now to my third and final point that I wanted to mention today, or deal with today, namely economy and society in Herodian Galilee. We're over our time, are we? Chairman, are we okay for time? Okay? Okay. The economy and society in Herodian Galilee. Because I think there's no topic that has been more debated and so many different points of view being put forward in this regard. It's interesting, by the way, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, that many of the recent discussions about the historical Jesus, seems to me, have been so concerned with the economic and social realities and not very much about the religious realities. I haven't read the book about the historical Jesus yet, which discussed the fact of whether or not he prayed, and if he prayed, what did he pray to, or what might have meant to him in his life. But there you are. It's the trend of our times, I suppose, that we are all pseudo-Marxists, and we want to find out exactly what the story is in terms of the economy and society. So the question really boils down to, did Antipas's reign help to stimulate the Galilean economy, if we can use such a modern jargon, or did it increase the burden on the small landowners, who on the basis of both literary evidence and archaeological surveys dwelt in the most part in the villages? It may be that there were micro-regional differences within Galilee itself, such as the lakefront area, and it could equally be true that some Galileans profited from the new regime more than others. Thus we hear of the grandees, the megistanes, and the leading men of Galilee, the hoi protoi tes Galileas, who were invited to the king's birthday party, together with the military officers, the Kiliarchoi, according to Mark 6:14. Who are the Herodians that we meet in the Gospels? A new class of administrators and landowners, or a small court circle? Can archaeology assist with these questions? In a pre-industrial world, land was a primary primary resource, always in high demand and in scarce supply as far as the ruling elites were concerned. The landowning patterns in Galilee and its surrounds that were established in the early Hellenistic period seem to have undergone little change under the subsequent regimes. It had been customary to talk about large estates, for example, based mainly on the parables of Jesus. But insofar as we can detect from surveys and so on, there's very little evidence for any of these in Galilee proper, as distinct, say, for the plain of Esdraelon in the south, where royal estates were continued on into the Herodian period as well. So this inference of an increase in absentee landlords and landless serfs during the first century is often based on the assumption that Jesus' parables reflect the actual rather than the imagined social world of Galilee. These images may indeed have been drawn from first-hand experience, yet they need not all have been drawn from Galilee. Jesus, after all, has spent some time in Judea. Both the literary and archaeological records suggest that at least from the Hasmonean conquest of the north, the biblical pattern of private ownership of the individual plots of land became the norm, a pattern continued also by Herod, as can be seen from his policy of allotments for his military personnel. It must be said that despite intense discussion and study of Galilean social life over the past 3 decades at least, no broad consensus has come about. Broadly speaking, 2 differing points of view have emerged. The one based on the notion of the ancient city as parasitic on the countryside, and the other claiming that increased urbanization and growth in population betokens increased prosperity for the population as a whole. The rising tide lifts all boats philosophy. The reign of Antipas provides a useful focal point for testing the first scenario, since, as noted previously, in a relatively short space of time, 2 urban centres had emerged in his rule. These developments took place during Jesus' own lifetime and are likely to have left some impression on the Jesus tradition, even if he avoided such places for principal reasons, as we'll talk about tomorrow. Members of the Context group here in America, which promotes the use of social scientific approaches to the study of the New Testament, have emphasized the need for models in exploring the social systems that were operative in the first century Palestine. According to a pyramid-style model drawn from cross-cultural examples, aristocratic empires concentrate all the power in a small ruling elite that is served by a larger retainer class of artisans, scribes, tax collectors, and other officials. At the base of the pyramid of power are the urban poor, slaves and other expendables, with the landed peasantry just above them in this hierarchical network of relationships. One of the books that Casey Hansen and Douglas Oakman, it's in the bookshop here, I think presents that material very well, and that point of view very well. In a similar vein, Richard Horsley has in various publications consistently placed a strong emphasis on the Roman imperial presence as the dominant social structure that shaped Galilean life, highlighting its demands on subject peoples, demands that led to, quote, the disintegration of the fundamental forms of social life that accompanied these economic burdens. That's Horsley's quote. For Horsley, therefore, Jesus should not be thought of as a wandering charismatic healer, as Gert Tyson has suggested, but as a prophet engaged in a program of renewal of village life that had come under severe pressure from a politically controlled economy. Before opting for this apparent consensus in terms of both Galilee's social and economic conditions and Jesus' role there, it is important to consider the alternative claims of other scholars and the evidence that they bring to the discussion. To begin with the respective roles of Sepphoris and Tiberias, it is worth reconsidering the extent to which claims about Sepphoris' significance for first century Galilee are warranted. The fact that the site of Sepphoris could be so thoroughly investigated from an archaeological point of view, whereas Tiberias, a modern city, the remains can only be discovered or uncovered in piecemeal fashion, may well have led to the exaggerated claims about Sepphoris on Jesus. In fact, the evidence of first century remains from Tiberias have indeed a decidedly Roman character, something that corresponds to Joseph's description of the place also. Sepphoris, a much older settlement dating back to the Persian times, as I've mentioned, was situated close to Nazareth and inevitably drew the attention of historians to its possible influence on Jesus. Furthermore, its refurbishment under Antipas, described by Josephus as constituting it as the, quote, the ornament of all Galilee, gave rise to the temptation for modern scholars to conflate the discoveries from different periods and attribute them all to the first century. Yet many of the more dramatic discoveries that can be seen at the site today, such as the villa that I showed, whose mosaics I presented earlier, the synagogue and even the theatre, at least in its more expanded form, are to be dated to the 2nd century and later, when the name of the place was changed to Caesarea and had much more important role in Roman administration of the region than was the case under Antipas. The implications of downgrading Sepphoris' role in the reign of Antipas would pose a question mark with regard to its fitting the typology of, quote, the consumer city, as described by Moses Finlay. Nevertheless, as a toparchic or main regional centre, one of 5 such in Galilee, Sepphoris still had an important role to play within the Galilean social and economic systems. Certain larger places operated as both distributive and administrative centres for the surrounding associated villages. Thus, for example, Josephus can declare that Sepphoris could have adopted a more independent stance in the first revolt against Rome had it chosen to do so, quote, situated in the centre of Galilee and surrounded by many villages. So, in other words, the suggestion is that Sepphoris was associated, had urban-rural relations were certainly available to it. On the basis of the archaeological evidence emanating from the excavations of various larger village sites, several other scholars have argued for an understanding of those systems as being much more integrated than suggested by the consumer city model. Thus, an important study of Antipas' reign by Morten Jensen, a young Danish scholar, he examined the evidence from 4 recently excavated sites in Lower Galilee, the Golan, namely Jotapata, the site where the revolt ended, the Galilean part of the revolt against Rome ended in 66, 67, Gamla, Capernaum, and Khirbet Cana. And Jensen claims that there is no evidence of any decline at these sites in the 1st century. Douglas Edwards, who participated in the excavations at Khirbet Cana and Jotapata up to his untimely death, has been a consistent supporter of the view that in the early Roman period, Galilean villages participated, he puts it, in the economic opportunities and dangers inherent in the Mediterranean system. In his opinion, he quote, it would be a mistake to assume that the Jesus movement operated in a cultural, political, or economic isolation from major urban centres. The evidence for these claims comes from a more sophisticated approach to our understanding of the Galilean economy. Edwards points to the importance of the road system, as well as the striking of native coinage for the movement of goods and services, coinage being, as it were, a form of stored value. And therefore it allowed for trading at much farther distance than simply barter system. Several villages are known as important centres of local production. Kfar Hanania on the borders of Upper and Lower Galilee, and Shechem close to Sepphoris being the best known because of the support for their products in the Jewish literary sources. This is Galilean ware from Kfar Hanania, found at Sepphoris, and then storage jars from the village of Shechem, 3 kilometres from Sepphoris. The wares from Kfar Hanania are to be found at both Jewish and non-Jewish sites such as Tel Nafa and Ptolemais, suggesting a wide distribution area that was determined more by commercial interests rather than religious or cultural differences. As an example of the competition that these Galilean wares faced, Edwards instances Meron, a thoroughly Jewish foundation in Upper Galilee. Kefrenania ware and imported eastern wares are almost equally represented in the remains at the site. This evidence allied to the discovery of dovecotes, oil presses, flax growing for weaving, quarries for stonemasonry, etc., convinced Edwards of the existence of varied and complex production and market conditions that cannot be subsumed under the general rubric of a politically controlled economy. Slides, I think just a few more. These are just examples of olive presses, wine, wheat, and olive oil, produce of the Upper Galilee, of a stamp from a seal from Kadesh with an olive or a vine cluster and a corn stalk together, and then also another example of an Upper Galilean close to Tyre, an example of another Galilean olive press. In this regard, the fish industry in the lake region is particularly significant. The technique of salting fish, developed already in Hellenistic times, made it possible to export them as far as Rome. The number of harbours, fish ponds and breakwaters discovered around the lake dating from Roman times is testimony to this situation. Just a few examples. This is an example of the waters of Galilee from Josephus. He mentioned about the springs and so on. We'll talk about that slide again tomorrow. This is a map of ancient harbours around the lake that was discovered a number of years ago at low water time, and it shows the amount of Roman period activity that went on around the lakeside. Particularly, I mentioned there Migdal, the centre of the fish industry, with the Greek name Tarakia, that is the salted fish. And this is, of course, the famous Galilean boat discovered in 1986, dated to the 1st century as well. Yet not everybody is so convinced by the inference of a vibrant economic environment based on this evidence alone. With regard to the pottery, Andrea Berlin, who's an expert in the field from the University of Minneapolis, has shown that a special type, which she describes as Phoenician semi-fine ware, that was probably produced in the environs of Tyre, is found at a range of sites in the circumference of Galilee, but never in the interior of Galilee proper. Some examples of this Phoenician semi-fine ware they are found in the circle of Galilee. She further claims that imported household wares that in the 1st century before Christ, BCE, were to be found at Gamla and other Jewish sites, disappear entirely in the 1st century of the Common Era, in other words, in the reign of Antipas, coinciding with what she describes as native resistance to Romanization associated with the reigns of the Herods. In a similar vein, the change in patterns of coinage from Tyrian to native Hasmonean found at Jotapata in the same time frame points to a similar disengagement from the larger region. Thus it would seem that the use of archaeological evidence alone to determine the economic realities cannot be decisive. Circumstances vary from place to place and period to period. Generalized ideas about a Mediterranean economy in which Galilee could participate need to be tempered by local circumstances, where factors other than commercial do in fact seem to have impacted on trade and commerce, at least to some extent. I'd be glad to hear I'm almost there. Faced with this division of opinion with regard to the economy of Galilee in the 1st century, it might appear unwise to draw any inference with regard to the nature of Jesus' ministry there. However, it does seem possible to find some middle ground that would provide help to the request. It would be highly unlikely that the immediacy of the Herodian presence, signified by Antipas's building projects, modest though they are, in comparison with those of his father, did not cause some problems for Galileans. In addition to the list that Mark gives us of grandees, that is, leading men and military officers, we should add the Herodians as well, it seemed, who probably were a new landowning class, as well as the ubiquitous tax collectors, as a reminder of the demands being made on the natives in terms of both a tributum capitis and a tributum soli, a land and a head tax. The benefits of the peace under Tiberias, of which Tacitus speaks, may not have touched everybody in Galilee as elsewhere equally. There are definite signs of social stratification in some of the larger villages, such as Jotapata, with its second Pompeian-style frescoes and wall paintings in one of the residences. But this is only half the story of the 204 settlements in Galilee of which Josephus speaks. At the time of the revolt, we hear of the residents of the smaller hamlets retreating to places like Jotapata and Gamla to escape the Roman onslaught. Placing these people on the social map in Galilee is not so easy. If we were to take Mark's picture of Galilee, written about the same time as Josephus' account of his own sojourn in the province, we find reference to villages with marketplaces, Mark 6:56, people with money who could be expected to purchase their own provisions, Mark 6:36, those engaged in the fish industry having hired servants, Mark 1:20, synagogues, at least in the sense of local communities, even if we cannot be sure that all had buildings, pre-70, medical practitioners who expected payment for their services, and so on. Clearly, Galilee's social organisation was mixed, as was its economy, and we cannot assume that all shared equally in the prosperity, if that is what we should call it, that is associated with Antipas's rule. Brief conclusion. We have focused on three aspects of Galilean life that are, as we shall see, highly relevant in terms of situating Jesus and his movement in Galilee, namely the continuing impact of Hellenization on the region, the nature of Galilean Jewish identity, and the economic and social situation in Galilee in the reign of Antipas. Archaeology has greatly assisted us in filling out or correcting the impression one gets from the chief literary sources. We've learned, one, that the epithet Galilee of the Gentiles is not an appropriate description of the region's ethos from the 1st century CE onwards, with the rapid increase of the internal migration of Judeans from the south. Secondly, we learned that there are unmistakable signs of Jewish practice and observance throughout the region, despite the intrusion of the Herodians. And thirdly, that while there is no trace of economic or social decline in some of the larger villages, nevertheless, the likelihood of social differentiation increased amongst the peasantry in the reign of Antipas. The effort to situate Jesus and his movement in this context will be both a challenge to and a testing of these conclusions. Thank you very much.